Thank you for coming this evening. Please turn to the book of Habakkuk as we continue this evening to discuss the message that Habakkuk has revealed in the scriptures. We look at the first few verses that we talked about last week. What did we conclude was the theme of the book of Habakkuk? What's the book primarily about? Frank?
Warning to the Chaldeans for their evil, and the warning that they will be punished for their evil.
Okay. So first of all, the Chaldeans were going to be punished, but what was the question that Habakkuk asked that led to that discussion about the Babylonians? What question or concern did Habakkuk have? Rick?
So, oh Lord, how long shall I cry? So he was crying for his nation. But he knew the Lord was in power, that God was in control.
Okay. So the theme was Habakkuk's question, though, on why the sin was allowed to continue in the nation. That it was evil in the nation. He talked about God, the first few verses that we talked about, God allowing wickedness, and wondering why, even though Habakkuk was praying for justice to be done, why it wasn't done, and the rulers were not correcting the problem. And then God's answer was, okay, he was going to send the Chaldeans. So we're going to discuss some more about that as we proceed from there. But Habakkuk had witnessed violence, trouble, problems in the nation, and the law was ineffective, justice didn't prevail. He asked how long this was going to continue, even though he prayed to God about it. And so it's similar to questions we have. Why does God allow sin? And many people question why God allows suffering and problems in this life. And God's answer, we're seeing beginning around verse 5, was that he was going to bring the Babylonians as punishment. But it's an answer to prayer, but it's not the one that Habakkuk expected. So we continue from there then this evening. So that really was what brought us down to verse 7, where we were at the end of our study last time. God's going to send the Chaldeans to punish the people. And so we're studying some of the characteristics of the Chaldeans. Verse 6 talked about how they were fierce and impetuous, or depending on your translation, bitter and hasty. And in verse 7, they were terrible, they were dreadful, and talked about how their judgment proceeded from within themselves, meaning they relied upon themselves. They did not trust in God or put their faith in Him, but their plans or ideas were their own ideas, their own plans, rather than God's. Okay, so the problem, the question of Habakkuk is the question of why does God allow sin, evil, to continue? What's He going to do about it? And when God says He's going to use the Chaldeans to punish the people for that, then He has another question that we'll see as we go along this evening. Okay, questions or comments anybody has through verse 7 as we were at the end of our study last time. All right, let's go ahead and read some more of it then. Let's read verse 8 through 11. We'd like to read chapter 1 for us, verse 8 through 11, please. Danny, please.
Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen press proudly on. The horsemen come from afar, they fly like an eagle swift to devour. They all come from violence, all their faces forward. They gather captives like sand. At kings they scoff, and at rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress, for they pile up earth and take it. Then they sweep by like the wind and go on. Guilty men, whose own might is their God. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O Rock, have established them for reproof.
Okay. All right, let's look back at as he continues describing the Babylonians. We've seen that they are fierce and they're dreadful. They trust in themselves rather than in God. But then in verse 8, he begins describing their horses. What does he say about their he uses some animals he compares them to. This is question number 15. He uses some animals to illustrate the Babylonians. What's the illustration that he uses? He compares them to what kind of animals, and what's the illustration? Verse 8. Terry.
Their horses are faster than leopards. They're like the evening wolves in their fierceness, and they're swifter. The horses are swifter, as if an eagle is flying into them.
Okay, so you've got leopards, wolves, and eagles. All of them illustrate different aspects of the Babylonians. And these are common illustrations that are often used in prophecy to describe various characteristics of nations. So the idea of the leopards would be those that they're swift and to run. The wolves are fierce, and the eagles hasten to eat, that they're taking spoils from others. So you have the idea that the animals, or rather the horses that are swift, and they're coming from afar, it says, charging ahead and taking, eating, that is what we would say gobbling up various nations, and that's going to come to Judah, and that's God's punishment upon Judah and that's basically the answer to Habakkuk's prayer. Why? What are you going to do about it? Well, this is what he's going to do about it. It's about the sins of Judah. He's going to bring Babylon. Okay? Other comments to verse 8. Terry.
The evening wolves carries with it the idea they're hungry and they leave nothing behind. They eat it all.
Okay. All right. Other comments on verse 8? Anybody? All right. Verse 9, he continues to describe the Babylonians. How does he describe them in verse 9? What does he say about them? Question number 17. How are they described in verse 9? What's their purpose in coming? What are they going to accomplish? Rick.
Well, they all come for violence, just like the eagle in the last verse comes to eat how strong he is. The Chaldeans, they come for the violence, and they set their faces against their enemies to take together captives like sand.
Okay. All right, so they're coming for violence. Like the east wind blowing, it's coming quickly, it's coming fiercely. You can't stop it, can't prevent it, it's coming. Other comments on the idea of gathering captives like sand? What will be the significance of gathering captives like the sand? Anybody?
Innumerable, without count. There's so many of them.
Okay, you remember that God promised that the descendants of Abraham would be like the sands of the sea. It's numerous, so many you can't count. Well, that's the idea. Now, these captives are like the sand of the sea. They're so numerous. So he's describing the fierceness, the power, and the irresistibility. You can't resist them. There's no stopping them. They're going to come, and you're going to suffer as a result. That's the answer to Habakkuk's prayer. That's how he's going to punish Judah for their sins. Okay? Other comments through verse 9. All right, how about verse 10? Question number 19. How does he describe him in verse 10? Terry.
They mock their enemies and they laugh at their attempts to defend themselves.
Okay. So they scoff at kings. It says princes are scorned by them. They're arrogant. They're convinced nobody can stop them. Kings might try to bring their armies and stand in the way. They're not going to be. Nobody can stop them. They're convinced of that. Every stronghold, whatever powerful walls that they might build for their city, is not going to stop the Babylonians. They'll just make mounds to attack and seize it. So they're convinced that nothing's going to stop them. That's the kind of people they are, and so far that's the way it's been. It will continue to be that way, even when they attack Judah. Eventually, that's going to bring down Judah as well. Whereas the Assyrians could not bring down Jerusalem, they brought down the nations around Jerusalem, but not Jerusalem. Babylon is going to take the whole nation. Okay? Question, other comments to verse 10? Anybody? All right, verse 11. Then, question number 20. Well, actually, question number 20. This is a little bit difficult, and there's different translations. But ultimately, what is the question I asked was, who do they give credit for their success? Verse 11. Who do they think gives them the power to succeed? Verse 11.
Their God.
Their gods. Okay? But again, depending on the translation, who do they think their God is? What God are they worshiping? Really?
Themselves.
Yes, themselves, and specifically their Auri, their power, their ability to destroy whoever they want that's in the way. Again, there's some questions of translation with it, but the idea is, instead of recognizing that God is using them to bring punishment on these wicked nations, which is what we've seen in many of the minor prophets, that God was going to use them to punish the nations, they think it's themselves, and so their power is in themselves, and their ability and their to defeat other nations, and they don't give credit to the true God. In essence, they're worshiping themselves and their own power, the power of their military, and so on. Other thoughts on verse 11? It does read differently in some different translations. Other comments on verse 11? Terry?
Well, I have a question.
Sure.
They didn't have any way to know that it was God using them, did they?
Okay, comments? How would they have a way of knowing that God was using them? Well, should the people of Judah know that God was using Babylon? They should have known, shouldn't they?
After Habakkuk wrote.
Yes. But it's not just Habakkuk. The other prophets that we've read already before this, Nahum said this similar, I think, Terry.
Well, God had promised that he would do that to them, but I'm thinking of the Babylon and Assyria. They didn't have any way of knowing. They didn't have a prophet coming to them saying God's going to use you to punish his own people.
Maybe that's directly so. Nevertheless, while they may not have known that specifically, what should anybody know about their successes? About their whatever they accomplish in life? What should anybody know about that? Shouldn't anybody know that ultimately God is the source of whatever success we have in life? And that he's the one who enables us to accomplish that ultimately they would not be victorious like this if it weren't for him. Admittedly, they're not going to believe it because they don't have the right God. But really, isn't that the mistake? And that's really part of question number 21, why I ask. Isn't that the mistake that people in general make today? They take credit for the things that happen in their lives that they think are good. They take credit for it. They think that they're smart or well-educated or influential or whatever. I built up this business. I was able to accomplish this, rather than giving thanks to God, appreciating what they've got as being a blessing from God. So I don't know that they would have reason to know specifically that God was telling them what specifically, but they should have recognized that God was behind their success, or else they wouldn't have been able to be successful. It seems to me that, and we're going to see that before we get through with our studies, that God blames them for the fact. He critiques them for the fact that they didn't give him credit for their accomplishments, but took credit to themselves. That's not here in Habakkuk, but we'll see it before we're through. Terry?
When people allow God to lead their minds and their thinking, they can't give him credit because they no longer know who he is. And that doesn't make it right, but that's what happens to you when you leave God out of your life and out of your thinking, it skews who gets credit, and you take it for yourself. And it's a curse on you because you pass that on to your children, the associations that you have.
And we see that more and more in our own society as we, more and more people in our society lose their faith in God, lose their trust in His blessings, as He's the one who gives them good, that they fail to study their scriptures, don't recognize that the Bible is the Word of God. And so more and more people take credit, even when people tended to believe in God more so than they do now, even then, often it was easy for people to take credit to themselves for whatever good things happen in their lives. But more and more it's a problem in our society because now people don't read their Bibles like they used to, don't worship God like they used to, and so as a result, they're like the Babylonians. They don't give God credit, but they take it to themselves. Okay? Other comments on the problem of trusting themselves in their power through verse 11. Anybody? Okay. So now we need to begin it and read some more, and we're going to see Habakkuk's response. All right, so first of all, we've got the first question that Habakkuk asked. His first question was, what are you going to do about all the evil that's around us in this nation? And God's answer was, okay, I'm going to send the Babylonians. Now Habakkuk's got another question that comes from that, and we'll see that as we go. So let's read verse 12 through the end of the chapter. Who'd like to read chapter 1, verse 12 through 17? Chapter 1, verse 12 through 17. Who'd like to read that for us, please? Neil, please.
Are you not from everlasting, O Lord, my God, my Holy One? We will not die. You, O Lord, have appointed them to judge, and you, O Rock, have established them to correct. Your eyes are too pure to approve evil, and you cannot look on wickedness with favor. Why do you look with favor on those who do treacherously? Why are you silent when the wicked swallow up those more righteous than they? Why have you made men like the fish of the sea, like creeping things without a ruler over them? The Chaldeans bring all of them up with a hook, drag them away with their net, and gather them together in their fishing net. Therefore they rejoice and are glad. Therefore they offer a sacrifice to their net and burn incense to their fishing net, because through these things they catch is large, and their food is plentiful. Will they therefore empty their net and continually slay nations without sparing?
Okay. So now Habakkuk has another question. So he asks his first question, why do you allow this evil to continue? God's answer, I'm going to punish the people, I'm going to bring the Babylonians. But now that brings a question for Habakkuk that he doesn't understand God's use of Babylon. So verse 12, what question does he ask? How does he approach his question beginning in verse 12? This is question number 22 now. What does it say about God in verse 12 that leads him to wonder why God's going to do it the way he is? What does it say about God in verse 12? Terry.
I must have looked at this differently. You're on question 22, right? Yeah.
Yes.
I put that in response to the confidence that Habakkuk expressed, that he understands they're not going to die.
Okay, that's part of it. Okay. We can talk about that for a little bit. Why does he think, what does he mean when he says we shall not die? Who's he talking about? And why would he say it? Rick?
God's people.
Okay.
He just says, are you not everlasting? He's putting another question to God. So, Lord my God, my Holy One, you have appointed them for judgment, rock, you have marked them for correction. So he knows God has the power.
Okay? All right, so God has the power to bring destruction. He has power to bring judgment, but he's convinced that they will not die. Why would he know that they're not going to die? Does he mean nobody's going to die? Terry?
Well, he remembers God's promise.
Okay. So he knows that even though Babylon may come, or any enemy may come, they're not going to completely destroy the nation, because God, what promise that God made? What had God said that would help Habakkuk to know that the nation's not going to be destroyed? What is the promise that remains yet, that assures him of that? Terry? Frank?
That there would be a remnant. There would always be a remnant to survive.
Okay, there will always be a remnant. We'll talk about that some more before we're done. There will always be a remnant. And in particular, why will there always be a remnant? Terry?
He's promised his son. He's promised to send him the Redeemer, and he'll do that.
Okay, we have the promise all the way back to Abraham of a blessing on all nations, which would be fulfilled in Christ, and then David, that would be a descendant of David, and so on. So we have, through the prophets, going all the way back to Abraham, the promise of one who would come, and then you have the other prophets, even that some that have come before Habakkuk, Isaiah and others, describing the coming of the Messiah. David talked about it in the Psalms, the coming of the one who would be the ruler of God's people, the high priest ruling on his throne, and so on. So that hasn't been fulfilled yet. God can't allow the nation to be destroyed until those promises are fulfilled. So that's what it seems to me like Habakkuk is saying. He knows that God is going to bring punishment. Yes, okay, fine, but he's not going to destroy the nation. They're not going to all die, because if they did, that would violate God's own promises. All right, so he has that confidence, first of all, that God is not going to allow the nation to be destroyed by the Babylonians. Okay, other comments on verse 12. But he's got another problem. He has that confidence, but he has a problem. Even though he has that confidence, he has a problem in verse 13. And what problem is that? Verse 13, and question number 24. He still has a complaint, even though he knows the nation's got to come straight. Danny?
I believe it goes with the end of verse 12 there, where it's talking about, he's appointed them to judge and establish them to correct. But then he recognizes God's power in placing, those who are in power. But then in verse 13, he's also recognizing God's goodness, and I think he's saying truth, but it's almost through his own wisdom coming to a conclusion like, how can you approve this? I don't know, when I read it, that's kind of what I'm getting.
Okay.
You put these people in power, but your eyes are too pure to approve evil, and you cannot look on wickedness with favor.
Okay, and then the last part of the verse 2, he says, how can you hold your tongue when the wicked devours a person more righteous than he? Well, who in particular would that be? But in the context now, the discussion, God says, I'm going to bring the Babylonians to punish the people of Judah. And Habakkuk says, how can you allow somebody to punish or devour somebody who's better even than they are?
Habakkuk knows his own people are evil. That's why he started the first part of the book. Why are you letting all of this go on? But he also knows that the Chaldeans are even worse. And so he's asking, how are you able to use an even worse people to destroy us? Why are you going to give them success?
Okay, so again, put yourself in Habakkuk's position and try to think of it. And it wouldn't be hard to do if you think of it in our day today. If we were to say, I understand God isn't going to speak to us directly, but if we knew, if somehow we could know, we look at our nation, we say, this is a bad nation. There's a lot of wickedness. We've got all this sin and so on. This is wicked. And if God could speak to us, which I know he doesn't today, like he did with Habakkuk, we don't have prophets, but if he were to speak and say, well, I want to fix it. I'm going to bring the Chinese, and I'm going to cause them to destroy much of the nation, United States. And many people are going to be punished. And they're going, what would our reaction to that be? Wait a minute. Why the Chinese? Why would you use, or some other, if you want to bring some other nation, why would you use such a wicked nation to punish this nation? So why do you hold your tongue when the wicked devours a person more righteous than he? Okay? So that's his problem. He says, you are purer eyes than to behold evil. You can't look at wickedness. Why would you give your approval to that? To allow this wicked nation to come and overcome Judah, even though Judah's bad, they're not as bad as the Babylonians. Okay? Yeah, that's exactly what I see he's asking the question. You see, God is too pure to allow that, this more wicked nation to destroy and punish the nation of Judah, who's as bad as they are, not as bad as the Chaldeans. Okay? Does that make sense? Questions or comments? Terry?
I think Habakkuk just needs an answer for this. He cannot understand it. It does not make sense to him for what he knows about God. And yet it leaves out the fact that God knows and will always act righteously. And God knows what he needs to do to bring about his purpose. And sometimes that's what we forget too, that there are things we cannot know that God knows. And so he can make decisions and act in a way that would not make any sense to us because we can't know what God knows.
Okay, so this is the problem that Habakkuk has then. And he uses an illustration in the last part of the chapter that we'll talk about in just a minute. But I'd like for us to spend a little time on questions number 25 and number 26. When Habakkuk raises this complaint, and Terry has introduced really question number 25 for us. Here's Habakkuk's got this complaint. What can we learn from Habakkuk's complaint here? Not just specifically about this particular situation, or any question or criticism that people might have of God. What can we learn from the fact that Habakkuk is doubting why God would do this? Comments on that question number 25, anybody? Terry.
One of the things I see is that it is all right with God when we have a question, when we bring it to him, and he will supply us with the right answer. When we try to figure out the answer for ourselves, we may come to the wrong conclusion. We will come to the wrong conclusion. But when we have a doubt, don't hide it. Don't just disregard God because you have a question about him, but bring that question to God, honestly, like Habakkuk is doing, to get the answer that will solve the problem you're having with understanding what God is doing.
Okay, now your last two comments really go together. The one thing is, yes, we should realize that there are questions we don't know the answer to, that God would know the answer to. So it's not bad. In fact, it's perfectly legitimate to wonder about those kind of questions and to wonder what God's answer would be. The other hand, though, you already made the point, Terry, sometimes even then we're not going to know the answer because there are things that God knows that we don't know. There are answers that are simply not revealed and won't be revealed in this life, at least Deuteronomy 29 and passages like that, that the secret things belong to God, the revealed things belong to us and to our children. So in this case, God gives an answer to Habakkuk, and he's going to answer the second question too, before we're through. But God doesn't always answer. God doesn't always give the answer because he knows what he's doing, as in the case of Job, which we made that comparison last time. God never did answer Job's questions. Job was complaining about why God allowed him to suffer. God never did answer the question, but what he did do is he showed that he was in charge. and Job should simply accept. So there's two parts to it. Number one, yes, trust God to have the answers to the questions, but understand he's not always going to give the answers to us. No matter how we might want them, he's not always going to give them. Okay? Other comments on that approach of Habakkuk to this problem? Anybody? Okay. And then another aspect of it that I think it's important for us to remember is that when we ask our questions, we should ask it respectfully. Job made the error of going too far, criticizing God, blaming God, as though God had done something wrong. And that's one part of God's response to him, was that what right did he have to criticize God when God is the ruler of all? So if we ask questions of God, we have questions, remember always God's in charge. Don't use our human opinions, our own human wisdom to criticize God as though he's done something wrong, because God never does wrong. He's always right whether we understand it or not. Okay? Other comments on question number 25 and Habakkuk's approach to God here? Terry?
We see that same kind of questioning going on when Gideon comes before God and wants to be sure that he understands what God wants him to do and that he's going to do it. He asks God, and God doesn't rebuke him for asking and then asking again, even after he said, I'll only ask you one time. He goes back and asks him again to show me. And God doesn't rebuke him for that. And it seems that our heart, God reads our heart. He knows where we're coming from. And putting our questions before him and getting the right answer for those questions is important to us. It leads to our faith being stronger. When we just keep doubting and do anyway, that's not right.
Not only Gideon, but there are lots of examples of it. You can go back to Abraham. And God had promised a son, and through that son would come all these great blessings, and he didn't have a son. And so Abraham questioned God about that too, and wondered about that. So there are lots of examples of it. It's not unusual for God's people to have questions about what God's doing. Trust in him. Understand you won't always know the answers. Study in our case, we have to go to the Bible for the answers, because that's how he speaks to us today. Study the Bible with an honest heart, but understand sometimes you won't know, but always understand that what God is doing, he knows what he's doing, whether we know or understand or not. Danny?
I think the part that's interesting about this, and I was trying to explain it earlier, but I don't think I was getting across, in 13, where he's saying, and you cannot look on wickedness with favor. And then he turns around and says, why do you look with favor on those who deal treacherously? So he's stating what he knows about God, but he's also questioning what he thinks he's seeing out there that doesn't quite go with what he knows about God. But that's his assumption. Does that make sense?
Okay.
He's sitting there, he's turning around saying, you cannot look on wickedness with favor. But then he turns around and says, why do you look with favor on those who do treacherously?
All right, I think that leads us to question number 26, which I think is one of the things from the book that's, for many Christians, difficult. And that is, why does God use wicked people? That's what he's saying. I'm going to use Babylon to punish Judah. And Habakkuk's saying, why would he use wicked people to do this? So the question I want you to consider is, can you think of other examples in which God uses evil people to accomplish God's purposes? And as we look at those examples, is God then somehow violating those people's power to choose? Is he making people evil if he uses them to accomplish his purpose? So can you think of other examples? Here we got the Babylonians. God said, I'm going to use them to punish Judah. That's clearly what it says. You have some other examples that you can think of where God uses evil people to accomplish God's purpose. Danny, do you have your hand up?
I think one of the common ones we all think of would be Pharaoh. with the Israelites when they were enslaved in Egypt. He used hardened his heart. He talks about against the people so that he could show his might, but not meaning that Pharaoh was, he was making the Pharaoh that kind of person. Pharaoh was already that kind of person.
Okay, so there's a good example of it. And God expressly said he was going to use Pharaoh to bring glory to himself. That when he would send Moses and Aaron to tell Pharaoh to let the people of Israel go from slavery, Pharaoh was going to refuse. And God said he was going to bring these various plagues and so on. And that would, in the end, Pharaoh would let the people go, but God would receive glory because of the victory over not only Pharaoh, but the gods of Egypt and so on. So there's an example where God's using Pharaoh, but as Danny pointed out, he didn't make Pharaoh evil. Pharaoh was evil to begin with, but he used him as one who was evil to accomplish God's purpose. Okay, other examples. Anybody else have an example of God using evil people? Terry.
Assyria and Israel. Assyria.
Okay. Well, he's already used the Assyrians as to punish Israel. Now Babylon to punish Judah. Other examples, anybody? Sabrina.
In the New Testament, with all of the persecution and things that were happening to Christians, they would travel to different places and spread the word even more to get away from that persecution.
Okay, so God would use persecution as a way of helping the gospel to spread. Okay, there's an even more obvious example that nobody's mentioned yet that should come to our mind. What's in the New Testament? Very obvious one. In the New Testament, God used evil people to do what? To kill Jesus, the crucifixion of Jesus. He couldn't use good people to do it. It had to happen, but he couldn't use good people. So who did he use? He used the Jewish, especially their leaders, and the Romans. But did he make them be evil? Well, they were evil to begin with. All right, and there are other examples we could give. So let me list some examples before we close. Judas. He used Judas to betray Jesus, but Judas was already evil. He proved himself to be evil. Pharaoh, we've talked about that, but he was already evil. The Jews and the Romans killed Jesus, but they were wicked people that he used. Assyria, Babylon, we've used. And how about the fact that he used Israel to bring Jesus into the world? Israel was a wicked nation. We've seen this repeatedly, but God was still using them. Okay, so we have the conclusion there, and this is something we have to learn. And I struggled with it for a long time. Maybe some of you struggle with it too. These people were wicked, but God was still able to use wicked people to accomplish his purposes. Habakkuk struggling with that. And before we're through, as we go along, we'll learn some more about it. Questions, comments, or discussion through verse 13, and we'll take up with verse 14 next time. Okay, thank you.